All right, hello class. Hope you're doing okay. We are going to talk today about writing about literature, which is actually a very different thing than writing a basic composition essay. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right. So how to write about literature. Writing about literature is very different from writing a standard composition essay. It requires much more than regurgitation of a text from memory. You will need to develop the ability to critically analyze a text and produce an argumentative thesis and topic sentences to base your analysis on. So this is very different. A lot of people, when they come into literature class, they think, oh, this is the class where I read books and then I regurgitate what happened in the books, and then that way the professor will know that I read the book and there won't be any problem. That's a book report. What we're doing here is a argumentative essay. Now, from 1101, if you took 1101 with West Georgia Tech, you should have had some sort of experience with argumentation, but you never really did it with a text. So the key is to teach yourself how to analyze a text. And so how do we do that? The first thing you need to do is teach yourself to find signs, okay? So you need to train your eye to look for signs. A sign is a phenomenon in the text from which we can derive meaning. A sign can be almost anything, including an object or imagery, a linguistic style, repetition of certain words, or any literary device. It's very, very open what a sign is. As long as you can point to it in the text and say, hey, here's a thing, and I think that means something, then it's a sign. So it could be tangible and it could be abstract. It doesn't really, it could be like a physical object or a character, or it could be something that's very abstract and has to do with the style of the way that it's written or something like that. It really doesn't matter. So I have a couple of examples. Hopefully you guys, you'll know the vulture eye because we look at Poe. But the Katniss Everdeen's bow and arrow. That's the one we're going to start with. So Katniss Everdeen, the main protagonist of the Hunger Games, which many of you probably know, a very popular series of books, young adult books and movies. Katniss Everdeen lives in a sort of dystopian world. It's very stratified in accordance with class. And she lives in like one of the poorest districts in the nation. It's a district that basically mines coal for a living, and it's very hard life. So she uses a bow and arrow to hunt squirrel as a little girl, but then she goes through the Hunger Games and she still uses the bow and arrow as her weapon of choice, despite the fact that they live in a technologically enhanced era where there could be machine guns or all kinds of other things that she could use. She chooses the bow and arrow. So we have to ask why. Why give this character a sort of primitive weapon in the story? That is a sign. We know that there's something going on there. The next one is the old man's vulture eye and the telltale heart. Why the fixation on the eye? What's the deal with it? What is Poe trying to signal through this symbol or sign? And then the last one is the apocalyptic rhetoric of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Silent Spring was a environmentalist piece. It was written as a sort of a compelling call to stop using something called DDT, which is a very dangerous pesticide. And they found actually that DDT was destroying the ecosystem quite literally. And because of Rachel Carson's book, it is no longer used in most places in the world. There are still some places that use DDT. But the important thing is that the apocalyptic rhetoric, so the sort of the tone that she takes about how the world is going to end if we don't put a stop to these harmful chemicals, that is a sign. That creates an effect. What kind of effect does it create? So once you have your signs and you go through the text and you circle things and you make little notes and stuff and you find your signs, you have to interpret them. What do these signs mean? How do we figure out the meaning? We brainstorm ideas for potential meaning of signs by considering the relevant context surrounding said signs. So you have to think about context. What does this mean in terms of the story, in terms of the time that this was written, in terms of the author and all this stuff? You just think about the context. So we go back to Katniss Everdeen's bow and arrow. On the surface, her choice of this weapon seems arbitrary, but if you analyze context closely, you get a deeper meaning. In this case, the context demonstrates that Katniss lives in a time of great technological advancement. Weaponry in her day and age is very advanced, and so using a primitive bow tells us something about her character. She relates more to a time when people were more self-reliant and less dependent on technology. Her use of the bow and arrow is an overt rejection of the technologically enhanced dystopia in which she lives. Okay, so that's true. It's like the bow and arrow is a sign that she rejects the way of the world as it is with all of its technology and its evils and stuff. She's against it. Okay, next, consider the old man's vulture eye in the telltale heart. On the surface, it's just a creepy aesthetic choice made by Poe to enhance the Gothic elements of his story. But once again, context tells us more. The vulture eye and the narrator's obsession with it harken back to the concept of the evil eye, an ancient term meaning a curse given to you by an enemy. We see from this context that the eye has always been associated with superstitious tendencies and strange fixations, which, in the wake of the scientific revolution, would have been more akin to madness than anything near the truth. Poe then is trying to put himself inside an irrational mind and emulate the compulsory fixations that they exhibit. He is also, subtly, showing the conflict between modern science and ancient superstition, thereby indicating that the death of rational thought comes paired with the dangers of psychosis. Okay, that may seem like a lot to just get out of that one sign, but if you follow it logically, it makes sense, right? If you make the comparison to the evil eye and to superstition and all that stuff, and Poe is living in the wake of science, and instead of looking at things in terms of superstition and all that stuff, we're trying to figure out the rational causes for things. So he's embodying that conflict through the use of this eye in this story where he's trying to understand the psyche of a killer. Next, consider the apocalyptic rhetoric of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a text which catalyzed the modern environmentalist movement as a good example of a non-figurative or non-tangible sign. In the case of Carson's rhetoric, this is not a physical or direct object mentioned by the author. This is a tone achieved by the work, but it is nevertheless a valid sign for analysis. Here is an example of what we mean by apocalyptic rhetoric within the text. We stand now where two roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed. But at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last and only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. So you can hear in her tone, she's very scared that we're going to destroy ourselves with our various modern techniques, including, of course, the use of DDT, this dangerous chemical. So this rhetoric creates a sense of urgency in the reader. It relays the point that the environmental consequences of DDT are too disastrous to bear. So when you read this book, and I have read it, the effect that it has on you is you get really like, oh my God, we got to do something. This is terrible. That is intentional. That's why she selected that tone, and it pervades the entire text. It's called Silent Spring, meaning a spring without songbirds and stuff. They're all dead because of the chemical. So the whole book is steeped in this like apocalypse feel, and that's a sign. Why does she do that? What effect does that have, right? And so we just explained it. Now that's several paragraphs, right? It's a lot of text, but if we want to condense it, we can when we get down here to claims. But first, let's talk about patterns and trends. So sometimes when we come up with a meaning behind a specific sign, we realize that it's going to be hard to get three full pages while focusing on that one specific sign. Like if you were going to write a whole essay on just the vulture eye, you would have a hard time, right? So in that case, we look for patterns in the text for other signs that could be lumped together or grouped with our signs to create a pattern of meaning that runs throughout a text or a series of similar texts. We can then group these signs together to create a consistent thesis claim. For example, the vulture eye in Edgar Allan Poe might not make an entire paper on its own, but if you can combine it with other similar signs from either the Telltale Heart or other Poe stories with similar themes, you can create a consistent thesis that juggles multiple signs across one or more texts with a singular analysis in mind, an argument about how all three of those signs sort of fit together, right? So that's a lot. The analysis was a lot. We wrote paragraphs basically about what each sign meant. But if we're going to make claims, and that's what the thesis and topic sentence needs to be, they need to be argumentative claims, then we need to condense all of that stuff into one sentence. So going back to that analysis that I just did, I'm going to show you how we can condense those blocks of text into claims. Now, the only thing that I've left off of these claims, because I want to do it in the next step, is the so what factor, which is a very, very important thing, and we're going to talk about it. But this is minus the so factor, what a claim would look, the so what factor is what a claim would look like. To create a claim, simply condense your sign with the explanation of its meaning into a short and cohesive statement. Using the three signs from above, here are three claims minus the so what factor, which we will address. In The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen's bow and arrow represents a fundamental rejection of the technological dystopia in which she lives. Okay, that's a claim, right? It represents a rejection of the society that she lives in. Okay. The next one, in The Telltale Heart, the vulture eye represents a superstitious fixation, which signifies the narrator's irrational mentality. Okay, another strong claim, right? Now the last one. In Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, her apocalyptic rhetoric creates a sense of urgency regarding environmental catastrophe. Okay, there, those are three claims. The only thing that are missing is the so what factor, so that's what we talk about now. By themselves, there's one thing that these claims do not accomplish. They don't tell us why the claim itself is important or why we should care about it. In other words, they do not answer the dreaded question, so what? Here are the same claims with the so what factor added. So I'm explaining why we should care about the argument that we've made, basically, right? So the bow represents a rejection of the society. So what? Well, in The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen's bow and arrow represents a fundamental rejection of the technological dystopia in which she lives, therefore encouraging a push towards practical self-reliance as a way to protect individual freedom, right? The Hunger Games is all about, it's a dystopia, which means it's a warning for we're going in a bad direction and we need to turn it around. So what is it saying? The text is using this bow and arrow to say, hey, self-reliance, self-dependence, less of an emphasis on technology. These are all valuable in the face of what is really like social media and technology and cell phones and stuff are really destroying a lot of our society. Not to get hyperbolic, but it's pretty much true. If you don't believe so, you can watch. There's a documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which dissects the various psychological and social consequences of this stuff, and it's really, really heavy. So maybe it wouldn't be the worst idea if we would get rid of the cell phone and go practice some archery, right? Okay. In The Telltale Heart, the vulture eye represents a superstitious fixation, which signifies the narrator's irrational mentality, thereby emphasizing the scientific notion that madness involves a deviation from what is rational or real. So here Poe is basically saying this guy's crazy because he's irrational. What is sane is rational. What is insane is irrationality. And that's a very post-scientific revolution type of thing to think. What was madness prior to the scientific revolution? Well, it was demons. You were afflicted by demons. You had demons in your head, and you know, I mean, stuff like that. And so this is a very new way to look at the situation and to explain madness. And in the context of Poe's time and place, that's actually really clever. Okay, here's the next one. In Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, her apocalyptic rhetoric creates a sense of urgency regarding environmental catastrophe, calling for readers to examine their own contribution to the decline of the natural world. The so what factor is you are destroying the earth, you need to stop, right? That's what Rachel Carson's message is. That's what you get from her apocalyptic rhetoric. So there. Each one of these could stand as either a thesis or a topic sentence. If it was a part of a bigger argument with other signs, it could be a topic sentence. If you were just going to write a whole essay on Rachel Carson's apocalyptic rhetoric, that one sentence could be a thesis. It has the identification of the sign, the list of the significance of the sign, and then the so what factor, explaining why the sign matters. This is the formula for claims. You should structure your thesis that way. You should structure your topic sentence that way. So in the text, the author, each of these claims, if you need more to work with for a thesis, you could incorporate a pattern of signs. So if the vulture eye isn't going to do it, you could say, in the text, the author uses sign X, sign Y, and sign Z to achieve this significance and then so what factor, right? So you can, in your thesis statement, you're not confined to one sign. You could list several signs that have a similar meaning or that fit together in a pattern. And then you could say, they mean this, and so what? And then that could be your thesis statement. And then when you go to do your topic sentences, you just extrapolate each of the X, the Y, the Z, and then that's how you do the specific claims. And you still follow that same formula. You do the sign, the significance, and the so what. They call it the 3 S's. It's also known as the semiotic method. I didn't write that on this document because when I say semiotic method, it tends to students go, what? So I didn't write it down, but that's what it is. It's called the semiotic method, and it's the 3 S's: sign, significance, and so what. Okay. So the formula for the intro paragraph, once you have your thesis and topic sentences, I like to start there. I like to get the thesis done, then I do the topic sentences, then the hard part is over, right? Your essay is basically almost written in that case. Once you have that stuff, you're ready to develop your introductory paragraph. To help with this, I have created a formula for intro paragraphs. It goes as follows: hook, line, and sinker. So the hook is the attention getter. How do you get your reader's attention and get them invested in formal writing? It's easier said than done. Trust me, I read a lot of essays. Most of them are kind of boring, not to discourage you. But so how do you get me invested? How do you get my attention? There's a lot of things you can do. You can use a striking fact or statistic or something shocking or wow, I didn't know that. You can use a compelling quote. You can use a quote from the text or a similar text or a quote from the author. You can use vivid and descriptive language, describing the kind of scenery that's going on in the novel and is, getting people invested that way. You can use a highly specified and well-worded question, or any other formal writing method. I say formal because I don't want you to be cracking jokes, right? But a formal writing method which you can use to get the reader's attention. So get me invested, get my attention, get me invested in your essay. Then you move into the line. The line is, some people find this concept complicated, but it really isn't. It's just, it's the necessary context that you need to establish the thesis statement. So what do you need in order for the thesis to make sense? What is required? In this case, it's going to be anything that you need to tell your reader. So in the case of Edgar Allan Poe, do you need to tell them about the Romantic movement? Do you need to tell them about the scientific revolution? Do you need to tell them about his depression and some of his biography and some of the history of his works? Do you need to tell them what Gothic literature is? All of this kind of stuff is context that your reader needs to know if they're really going to understand your thesis statement. You don't need to give them a play-by-play of like every little detail of his life, but you need to have enough information in there to where when you write your thesis statement, when they read it, they know what's going on. So this is, the line section is relevant context, all relevant context that is needed for the thesis statement. And then lastly, in order, which you've already done this part if you started with it first like I recommended, the sinker is the thesis statement. So it always goes, this is in order, hook, line, and sinker. You start with the hook, you move to the context, you provide the thesis statement. The thesis statement is always the last sentence of the introductory paragraph. It always makes an argumentative claim about the text, and then you're going to break that claim down into the topic sentences. So then once you do hook, line, and sinker, you just put the topic sentences in place at the start of each body paragraph, and then you need to supply evidence to support the topic sentence. So if your thesis is a claim, a big claim, your topic sentences are minute claims, small claims. The evidence then is proving the claim, right? This is a process of like reasoning. You're proving something that you have said. So once you've begun your body paragraph with a strong topic sentence claim, then you must provide textual evidence to reinforce said claim. This requires the use of direct quotes from the text with parenthetical citations. You should always include a lead-in statement for quotes to avoid, quote, an alien landing. That's when a quote just drops out of the sky. You don't tell me where it came from. You just open the quote, put a quote in there, close it up. I'm like, where did this come from? So a lead-in statement is usually something like, according to one scholar, or as experts suggest, or as we see in the text, some kind of information to let me know, where is this quote coming from? Is this from an expert? Is this from the text itself? Is this from a peripheral subject? Like, where is it coming from? So that's what you need next. You got to have strong evidence. That evidence should be quoted directly. I know people are like, but I don't want to go in and type out the entire quote of a PDF that I can't copy and paste efficiently into Word. I get it, but paraphrasing is dangerous, man. You run the risk of changing what was said. You run the risk of confusing me as to what you said and what the author said. I would just do direct quotes every time. I say it to my classes all the time. Direct quotes are your friend. If you do it, direct quote, put the parenthetical citation in there. Remember the plagiarism stuff from 1101. You want to have it cited, and then that's how you enforce your. That's how you reinforce your claims. Okay. So then, once you have the evidence in place, the evidence it's important to note that the evidence does not always speak for itself. And I have an example called "Explain the Bloody Knife," okay? And forgive me for the sort of visceral nature of the image. Sometimes you have to speak for the evidence, okay? So if you put the same evidence in front of two people, there's no guarantee that they'll draw the same conclusions from it. That's kind of the problem with the truth, right? Is that sometimes we need to explain the framework that you're supposed to understand the evidence in so that you can draw the right conclusions about what it means. So once you provide a quote, do not assume that everyone else will interpret the evidence the way you do. Lead them to the conclusion you want them to draw by providing thorough analysis. Analysis is the area in where you, in your voice, explain exactly how the quote you provided proves the claim. In other words, explain the bloody knife. Bloody knife is an example that I use to show that evidence does not always speak for itself. Imagine that you walk into a classroom and there is a bloody knife on the table. What happened? While it's safe to say that leaving the room would be a wise move on our part, we don't necessarily know that someone was attacked. It could just be that the knife is a prop for the drama club's rendition of Romeo and Juliet. It could be that the knife was used to cut a misspelled steak there. It's a steak. It's supposed to be S-T-E-A-K. Sorry, it's a bit early. Or the janitor sliced himself by accident when opening a box of paper towels. Until someone walks in and explains what the knife is doing there, we won't know for certain if our urge to run away was justified or not. Likewise, you should explain very clearly and succinctly how each piece of evidence proves the claim put forth in the topic sentence. A few lines, 2-3 lines of analysis after each direct quote should do the trick. So explain the bloody knife. Don't let the evidence sit there and go, all right, they're going to draw the conclusion I want next. Don't do that. Explain it. Lead the horse to water. Tell me exactly what you want me to draw. What conclusion do you want me to draw from this evidence? Because if you assume that I'm going to see what you see, it's probably not going to happen. All right, so the final thing, the conclusion paragraph. The conclusion paragraph can be tricky because most students have been told simply to summarize the argument that they have already put forth for the better part of 3 pages. Everybody is told that from their instructors. I'm sure that there are instructors here at this institution that tell that to their students. As a preferential matter, and as an English teacher, there is a little bit more room for preference. I don't like that. And the reason I don't like that is not because I want to be difficult, but it's like, why do I need to read a summary of the argument that I just read for 3 pages, right? It's like repetitive. It's redundant. So while I understand the power of a closing summary to put things in perspective, in most cases, it's just repetitive. Instead, I prefer that my students try to achieve the tone of closure in their conclusion. This means that you should focus on wrapping up your argument instead of repeating it. You have a lot of freedom for how you choose to do this. You can make predictions, ask questions, speculate, mention related material that won't quite fit into the body paragraphs. Anything that helps you close out your argument is fair game. Just please do not summarize. So that can be difficult. People are like, well, what do I do if I don't summarize? You gotta let me know the argument is done. What else needs to be said? Do you need to tie up loose ends? Can you speculate about what this means? What should we take away from it? Right? Give us the takeaway. Give us so what you really need to know is that Edgar Allan Poe was showing us how we should look at the world in a rational way, right? That's the kind of thing you want to do in the conclusion. You have a lot of freedom here. You have a lot of mobility and malleability, and you can do different things. The important thing to know, though, is that the conclusion, as far as the essay goes, is not the most important part. In fact, I refer to it as the most difficult and the least important part of the essay. It's the most difficult because if you're not going to summarize, what do you say after everything has been said? And it's the least important because you've already said everything, pretty much. I mean, you've already given the argument, so now you just got to tie up the loose ends. So don't sweat the conclusion too hard, but definitely don't repeat yourself. And please, for my sake, don't put in conclusion, comma. Every essay I ever read has that. It's kind of silly to announce the conclusion that way, right? It's almost like breaking the fourth wall. You're drawing attention to the fact that your reader is reading an essay, right? So just try to break that habit if you can. If you have any questions about the conclusion, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to go into more detail with you on that. And then lastly, you do need a works cited page. Even if you don't use secondary sources from scholarly journals and the like, you still need to cite the main work, the primary source that you're using. So you'll need a works cited page. Make sure to include all the appropriate citation information for the text you're using. If you need a refresher on MLA, you can check the Writing Resources folder in Blackboard for the quick guide. You can also Google the Purdue OWL, which is the online writing lab, for a comprehensive MLA style guide. So these notes are available on Blackboard. You can find them both. I put them in the writing assignments folder, and I've also got them in the supplemental notes folder. And you can check this out on your own if you'd like. And please email me with any questions. I hope this helps you writing your essays for literature class. Thanks very much. Have a wonderful week.